Outside, snow fell quietly over the Black Sea coast. Inside the glowing Radisson Blu Hotel, an international summit was underway. But on the top floor, in a room without flags, without cameras, without live streams, a meeting was taking place that would alter the fate of an entire continent. Vladimir Putin didn't speak much. Seated across from him were not the usual TV-friendly presidents, but 6 men in worn military uniforms with eyes full of suspicion. Africa's shadow leaders, coup survivors, and military fixers. "We don't care how you get elected," Putin said flatly. "We care if you can hold your seat." The room fell into a loaded silence. Someone nodded. And just like that, an unwritten agreement was born. Russia wasn't entering Africa with warships or grand coalitions. It was coming through advisors, mercenaries, and promises without strings. Inside a GRU strategic document, the years 2020 to 2026 were branded as Operation Sahel Shadow, a stealth plan to penetrate fragile African regimes. Phase 1, Central African Republic, then Mali, then Sudan. But circled in red on the final page of the map, Burkina Faso. Not because of its population, not even its geographic value, but because of what lay beneath its soil gold. And what floated above it, a broken government, a fractured army, a disillusioned people. Because it was where the West once ruled and failed. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, France deployed troops, the US sent aid, and NGOs set up base. But after nearly 2 decades, the people were still poor, the insurgents still strong, and the government still just trading names, not tactics. Russia saw something else. Africans didn't need another lecture on democracy. They needed someone who'd stand next to them when the shooting started, no questions asked. That night in Sochi, nothing was signed, but Putin pulled out a map. He tapped a small dot in West Africa. Here, Burkina Faso. If trouble breaks out, we'll be there, before the UN finishes talking. No one replied at first. Then a colonel from Ouagadougou stood. He said just one thing, then we'll prepare. 6 months later, a young officer in Burkina Faso, his name Ibrahim Traoré, began rising through the ranks with unusual speed. No one questioned it. No one noticed he had just returned from a training mission in Belarus. No headlines, no chatter. But a move had been made on the geopolitical chessboard. A game with no king, only the first to strike. And that's how a plan to reclaim influence in Africa began. No gunfire, no parades, just a handshake behind closed doors and a quiet promise: we won't ask about democracy. We'll just help you stay in power. The city was restless, not in the way that made headlines, no protests, no tanks, but in that eerie, aching silence you only hear in places where things are about to break. In the middle of it all was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young officer with sharp eyes and a reputation so clean it made senior generals uncomfortable. At just 32, Traoré had already served in counter-terrorism operations across the north. He was educated, disciplined, and unshakably calm under fire. And unlike many of his peers, he didn't drink from the bottle of colonial nostalgia. He had no love for Paris, no dreams of an apartment in Marseille. He was Burkinabe to the bone, and his loyalty was to the land, not the flags that had flown over it. But there was something else about him, something colder, harder to read. Traoré's rise through the ranks wasn't meteoric, it was surgical. Step by step he moved into positions of influence. Logistics officer, intelligence liaison, regional commander. Every step calculated, every ally chosen carefully, every rival neutralized not with bullets, but with paperwork and quiet transfers. He was the kind of officer who answered questions with more questions, who could recite troop strengths and insurgent locations by memory, and who spoke French like a diplomat, and Moré like a revolutionary. His critics said he was too quiet to lead. His supporters whispered, "He's the one." In March 2021, during a so-called agricultural training exchange in Minsk, Belarus, Traoré disappeared from official communication for 72 hours. No one asked why. But when he returned, his demeanor had changed. still calm but sharper, less patient. He requested and was granted immediate reassignment to the capital, near the nerve center of military planning. At night, he was seen walking alone near the army archives. By day, he led quiet purges of officers, known to have foreign allegiances. Some believed he was grooming himself for power. Others believed someone was grooming him. According to leaked GRU files obtained by European intelligence, Ibrahim Traoré had been marked as a Tier 1 asset as early as 2018. His name appeared in internal Russian documents as Zoloy Noir Black Gold, a reference not only to his nationality, but to his perceived value in unlocking West Africa's geopolitical vault. The file described him as pragmatic, emotionally disciplined, deep mistrust of Western institutions, potentially moldable, highly protective of national sovereignty. What the file didn't say was more important. Traoré wasn't moldable. He was observant. He knew how foreign powers operated. He had watched the French drones fly over his villages, the American advisors speak in broken cultural cliches. He wasn't impressed. But he wasn't naive either. He understood that in geopolitics, idealism was just another form of submission. By late 2021, Burkina Faso's government was cracking. The president had lost control of key military units. Jihadist attacks were growing bolder. French forces had scaled back their operations. Rumors swirled of another coup. That's when Traoré made his move, not with tanks, but with silence. His men were loyal. His files were complete. His relationships with field commanders in the north gave him leverage. And behind him in the shadows were advisors who spoke Russian-accented French and never showed up on official manifests. By September 2022, the president was gone. No resistance, no riots. Just a calm transition announced on national television, delivered by a soldier with quiet fury in his voice. On his first day as transitional president, Traoré walked alone to the gates of the presidential palace. Behind him were no banners, no chanting crowds, just 12 men in black uniforms with no insignia. A journalist asked who they were. He replied simply, "They are here because France is not." The world blinked. Burkina Faso had a new leader. But more than that, Russia had a new foothold. And the man at the center of it, all the soldier called Black Gold, wasn't just a puppet or a patriot. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man with a plan, and now he had the power to carry it out. The world stopped breathing. Columns of Russian tanks rolled across the border into Ukraine. Western media declared it the return of full-scale European war. NATO scrambled. Sanctions rained down. Every headline screamed, Kyiv. But far from the missile trails and burned-out suburbs of Eastern Europe, a quieter war was unfolding in the shadows of the Sahel. This wasn't about borders or NATO lines. This was about influence, access, control, and it had started long before the first Russian missile hit Luhansk. While CNN broadcast bunker interviews in Kyiv and BBC counted refugee columns in Poland, the Kremlin launched its second, far less visible campaign, Operation Sahel Shadow Phase 2. This time the weapon wasn't artillery, it was loyalty. In intelligence war rooms in Moscow, a new map was unrolled, one not of Europe, but of West Africa. On it, 8 countries were circled in red. Burkina Faso had a star drawn over it, not for danger, for opportunity. It wasn't just Burkina Faso. In Mali, Russian operatives quietly replaced French soldiers expelled in early 2022. Wagner paramilitaries trained local militias, escorted convoys, and built relationships with mayors and military officials, all under the radar. In the Central African Republic, Russian security firms took over presidential protection duties and moved into the diamond sector. In Sudan, mining rights were traded for security consultation, with the details kept conveniently off record. Africa wasn't a sideshow to Russia's foreign policy. It was the backup generator. And Burkina Faso, it was next in line. The Kremlin had learned its lesson in Ukraine. Europe would push back. Sanctions would bite. The media would roar, but Africa wouldn't scream. Africa had been abandoned time and time again by Europe, by the US, by their own post-colonial elites. It was a land full of scars, resources, and hunger-fertile ground for promises with no lectures. And most importantly, no one was watching. By the time Kiev's sky turned red, Ibrahim Traoré was already having quiet conversations in Ouagadougou, not in press rooms, not in parliament, but in side corridors, airbase hangars, and embassy back doors. The messages were always short. The French betrayed us. The Americans never really came, but Moscow listens. What made Operation Sahel Shadow so dangerous wasn't how much force Russia used, it was how little. No invasions, no bombs, just advisors, just offers, just silence where the West once shouted. The Kremlin offered something that Western governments couldn't. We'll train your men, we'll guard your minds, we'll protect your president, and we won't ask what you do with power, only that you keep it. It was seductive, strategic, and it worked. By mid-2022, Traoré had cut off multiple military cooperation programs with France. He refused IMF aid. He quietly met with Russian energy and mining officials under the guise of regional development talks. In Paris, some analysts raised alarms. Burkina Faso is turning, but their warnings were buried under more urgent headlines: nuclear threats, gas shortages, wheat crises. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the groundwork was being laid not for a war, but for a realignment. What began as whispers turned into uniforms. What began as training turned into presence. And what began as a friendship turned into a foothold. Burkina Faso was no longer neutral. It had chosen. Not with a parade, not with a treaty, but with a phone call Moscow had been waiting 3 years to receive. The city was dark, not metaphorically, literally. The power grid had gone down 40 minutes earlier. First the banks, then the military headquarters, then the presidential compound. Cell towers blinked off one by one. Internet died. Radios fell silent. No alarms rang, only whispers. In an elite neighborhood just 2 kilometers from the presidential palace, 4 military trucks moved without headlights. Inside were men, not insurgents, but decorated colonels from Burkina Faso's old guard. Their faces were hard, their loyalty long frayed, and tonight they had one goal, a coup with a timer. The plan was precise, cold, and simple. 2:00 a.m., power cut. 2:15 a.m., secure state media. 2:20 a.m., seize the communications hub. 2:30 a.m., storm the presidential palace. They expected confusion, maybe even a firefight, but not resistance. Not from Traoré, the quiet soldier-turned-president who spoke more about gold mines and sovereignty than counter-espionage. They thought he'd panic. They were wrong. As the lead truck approached the palace gates, a deep thrum echoed from above. Helicopters. 3 of them, low, fast, and silent until they were directly overhead. Not Burkina Faso's, not French, no insignia, just cold steel. The convoy halted. Too late. Ropes dropped. Shadows fell. And before the colonels could issue a single command, their radios crackled with interference, then went dead. Inside the palace, Traoré stood in his command room, not in pajamas, not behind a desk, but in full military uniform, flanked by 12 men, in black fatigues with no name tags, speaking Russian-accented French. They weren't bodyguards, they were Spetsnaz. One of them leaned into his earpiece and nodded to Traoré. The perimeter is sealed. They won't make it past the gate. Traoré didn't flinch. He picked up the red landline, an old rotary phone, secure and analog. Call it in, he said. No emotion, no hesitation. By now, the coup plotters had realized the game was up. Their own reinforcements had vanished. Officers they trusted weren't picking up. Some had already switched sides. Others had never been with them in the first place. And he had let them plan, let them believe, let them gather in one place. Now they were surrounded not just by soldiers, but by the weight of their own miscalculation. At 2:52 a.m., the last rebel vehicle was set ablaze by a Russian-piloted drone. No blood spilled, but no message needed. Electricity returned. State TV flickered on. No national anthem, no emergency siren. Just a single camera feed from inside the palace. President Traoré standing alone. Behind him, no generals, no ministers. Only one man, a bearded figure in black, known in European intelligence files as GRU-LX7. Traoré looked into the lens. There will be no funeral for democracy tonight. Only a reminder this country does not kneel, not to colonels and not to colonizers. The feed cut, and the new era began. The next morning, foreign diplomats were left scrambling. France denied knowledge of any coup plot too quickly. The U.S. issued a bland statement calling for stability. Russia said nothing, but their media praised Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism. Within 72 hours, 3 new contracts were signed. Russian special advisors embedded permanently in the Presidential Guard. Exclusive mining rights negotiations with Rosgeo, a private communications satellite for national security purposes. No debates, no votes. Just control locked in before dawn. He didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. He simply told his advisors, "They thought I was alone, let them keep thinking that." And as the dust settled, one thing was clear, and neither would the rules of power in Africa. The smoke from the failed rebellion still lingered in the air, but the city was quiet, too quiet. No street celebrations, no angry crowds. Just silence, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from shock. Burkina Faso had seen coups before. It had buried leaders, revolutions, promises. But never anything like this. This time there was no power vacuum. Because Traoré hadn't just survived. He had taken control, and behind him stood a new kind of army, unmarked, unaccountable, and unmistakably Russian. Within 12 hours of crushing the coup, Traoré enacted a sweeping series of national emergency protocols, curfews in 5 major cities, the suspension of 2 independent radio stations, the arrest of 8 senior military officers under investigation, and the full restructuring of the Ministry of Defense. No vote, no press conference, just an official statement signed in black ink and delivered by armed guards to every state governor. At the heart of these changes was a new institution. The Bureau for Strategic Sovereignty, BSS, a task force, empowered to operate across ministries with no parliamentary oversight. Unofficially, BSS answered to only 2 people, Traoré and his Russian security liaison. Its mission: neutralize threats, optimize loyalty, enforce the pivot. For decades, Burkina Faso had danced between Western donors, development partners, and military assistance programs. France had troops on the ground. The U.S. had trainers in the north. Canada funded mining oversight, but now all of it was over. In a press appearance 3 days after the failed coup, Traoré stood beside a Russian delegation dressed not in suits, but in military uniforms. No flags, no translators. He looked into the cameras and said, "Burkina Faso will no longer outsource its survival. We will build with those who respect us, not lecture us." And with that, he tore up the defense agreement with France, ended USAID programs in 3 provinces, and ordered the closure of the EU's Regional Counterterrorism Bureau in Ouagadougou. As Western missions packed their bags, new players moved in fast. Russian advisors took over perimeter security at the presidential palace. A mobile comms unit operated by GRU-linked contractors was stationed at the Ministry of Information. Russian trainers began reorganizing the National Gendarmerie. But this was more than security. It was architecture. Russian economists flown in under the radar began auditing state mining contracts. Cybersecurity teams arrived to assist with infrastructure protection, but quickly took over digital communications nodes, once run by French telecom firms. Internally, not everyone was thrilled. Key cabinet members were unsettled. Civil society leaders sounded the alarm. This is not sovereignty, one lawyer warned. It's consolidation masked as independence. But Traoré didn't flinch. He knew what they didn't. That the April coup wasn't isolated, that more were coming, and that only decisive, ruthless restructuring could keep the government upright long enough to matter. The Russian presence gave him more than security. It gave him time to silence rivals, reshuffle command structures, and rewrite the political playbook before the next insurgent bullet left the barrel. Beneath the political maneuvering lay something even more valuable than control: Burkina Faso's gold. Over 70% of the country's exports came from gold. And yet foreign companies, mostly French and Canadian, controlled nearly all major operations. That was about to change. Traoré ordered an immediate review of all foreign mining licenses. Under the guise of economic rebalancing, dozens of contracts were frozen. In private meetings, Russian firms, some known for funding Wagner operations, expressed strategic interest in the country's gold reserves. One deal, according to leaked documents, included a clause security services in exchange for exclusive extraction rights. Supporters called it smart leverage. Critics called it recolonization under a new flag. The West did not sit idle. France declared Burkina Faso a state of concern. The U.S. downgraded bilateral security cooperation. The EU paused funding for rural development. But none of it mattered. Traoré had already replaced the support structure, and now he had a new talking point. We were promised progress for 30 years. All we got was poverty and bombs. Now we choose differently. And to many young Burkinabe, angry, unemployed, and exhausted by Western hypocrisy, his words rang true. By June 2025, the transformation was nearly complete. Burkina Faso looked less like a former French colony and more like a client state of Moscow, but one built by invitation, not invasion. Russian flags didn't fly over buildings, but their software ran national systems. Their agents guarded presidential corridors. Their funding backed infrastructure deals, and their strategy, slow, patient, surgical, was working. Traoré had bought loyalty with foreign muscle. He had silenced dissent with emergency laws, and he had rewritten alliances with a stroke of a pen. But he had also tethered his survival to an empire with its own agenda. If Russian interests shifted, or if Traoré overplayed his hand, the entire structure could collapse. And this time, there would be no third helicopter. And now, all that remained was to see whether Traoré had built a sovereign state or a golden prison. Ouagadougou, August 2025. President Ibrahim Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, overlooking a plaza that just months earlier had echoed with the roar of rebel trucks. Now it was quiet, orderly, controlled. To the outside world, it looked like victory. But inside the walls, and deeper inside the country, a different reality was unfolding. Because sovereignty, as it turns out, isn't free. It started small whispers in university halls, murmurings in market stalls, radio DJs choosing silence over sarcasm. Then came the statements, carefully worded, but unmistakable, from civil society groups. National dignity must not become national silence. A pivot is not a handover. Security without accountability is occupation by another name. In the capital, people were wary. In the north, where soldiers now patrolled in mixed uniforms, Burkinabe and Russian, they were fearful. No one doubted Traoré's strength, but many began to question what it was protecting and for whom. The Russian presence that once seemed like salvation had grown thicker. Military outposts expanded. Checkpoints became permanent. Training exercises blurred into joint operations. At the Ministry of Interior, key surveillance systems were now monitored with the support of Moscow-linked advisors. Phone calls flagged, movement tracked, algorithms trained to detect unrest. One opposition leader anonymously called it sovereignty outsourced to silence. Meanwhile, reports began to surface of Wagner-aligned contractors, negotiating security deals, not with the government, but directly with mining companies, bypassing state oversight. Was it protection, or was it privatized control? Nothing symbolized the dilemma more than the mines. Traoré had promised a gold revolution, local control, higher royalties, reinvestment into schools and roads. Instead, communities near major sites reported no change. In fact, in some areas, things got worse. Roads near gold transport routes were now off-limits to civilians. Villages were relocated with no compensation. Russian-language signs began appearing around extraction zones. A farmer in the Bongo region told an international aid worker, "We used to lose our gold to the French. Now, we don't even know who it goes to." By September 2025, Burkina Faso found itself increasingly alone on the world stage. The African Union issued a veiled warning about foreign militarization of sovereign states. ECOWAS froze development negotiations. The EU suspended $80 million in infrastructure support. Even Mali, another Moscow-leaning regime, grew uneasy. Rumors suggested Malian officials feared that Burkina Faso had gone too fast, too far, becoming a liability rather than an ally. Traoré's pivot was no longer seen as bold. It was seen as reckless. And while politicians debated sovereignty, the real enemy never left. Islamist insurgents adapted. They changed routes, used drones, co-opted communities angry over land grabs and mine closures. In July 2025, an ambush near the Niger border left 34 soldiers dead, the worst single attack since the pivot. In response, Traoré sent a battalion, half of them Russian-trained, into the bush. They returned 2 weeks later, exhausted, empty-handed. The insurgents had moved, but the resentment stayed. Because while guns can chase rebels, they cannot silence grievances. Inside the presidential compound, even loyalists began asking hard questions. Was the Russian presence permanent? What were they promised in return? Could a sovereign state function if its security and now its economy was being steered by outsiders? Traoré deflected. He tightened control. He reassigned ministers. He expanded the Bureau for Strategic Sovereignty. But rumors began to swirl that the Russian ambassador had more access than half the cabinet. That Traoré hadn't seen an independent journalist in 3 months. That new contracts were being signed in Russian. Traoré had redefined the state, but critics warned he hadn't reclaimed sovereignty. He had restructured dependency. The West may have demanded reforms and elections. Russia demanded silence and access. Neither, it seemed, truly supported African self-determination. One university professor put it bluntly. The French treated us like students. The Russians treat us like assets. Who will treat us like citizens in a remote village? Displaced by mining, a teacher stood in the ruins of his school and said, "They said this was about our future, but they never asked us what future we want." That's the truth Traoré couldn't suppress. That sovereignty isn't measured by which foreign power you choose to align with, but by how much of your destiny is truly yours to command. And in Burkina Faso, the answer remained unclear, and whether Traoré had the courage to face that price or just keep cashing the checks was the question that would define his legacy. October 2025, Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in the war room, not because of another coup, but because of something more elusive: doubt. Outside, the capital was stable, the streets were calm, no protests, no gunfire, no blackouts. On paper, he had won. But in the silence of that early morning, a question echoed in his mind. What exactly have we built? In just over 3 years, Traoré had transformed Burkina Faso from a French-aligned security state to a Russian-backed experiment, from a fragile democracy to a militarized presidency, from donor dependency to deal-driven survival. He had survived assassination attempts, crushed coups, and stared down foreign pressure. His approval ratings among the youth, especially those disillusioned with Western promises, remained high. But behind the success was a paradox. Burkina Faso was more secure, but less free. It had gained control, but lost clarity about its future. Across Africa, leaders watched closely. In Mali, Niger, and even Ghana, conversations were shifting. Could the Traoré model, direct deals, decisive power, no lectures be replicated? Could African sovereignty finally mean saying no to both East and West? Or was it just a mirage, a new master draped in a different flag? The debate had started, and it wasn't going away. The true war was never about rebels or rival generals. It wasn't even about Moscow or Paris. It was about the people, the farmers still waiting for land titles, the students whose schools remained closed, the nurses without medicine. Traoré could hold the palace with Spetsnaz, but he couldn't hold the trust of a nation without delivering something deeper. Jobs, justice, dignity. Those were the real battlefields, and he knew it. History will not judge Traoré for choosing Russia over France. It will judge him for what he does with the freedom he has claimed. Will he build institutions that outlive him? Will he open the books or just change the locks? Will he break the cycle or rename it? In a closed-door meeting with advisors, Traoré reportedly said, "If we fail, they will say we traded one chain for another. If we succeed, they will say Africa found its spine." The truth is likely somewhere in between. But one thing is certain: the next chapter of Burkina Faso, and perhaps of Africa, won't be written by foreign powers. It will be written by the people who refuse to accept that sovereignty is a slogan, who demand that it be real. As autumn fell over the Sahel, a strange equilibrium took root. Burkina Faso was not in flames. It was not in celebration. It was in suspension, like a breath held too long. Traoré had delivered what he promised: security order, and a government no longer beholden to Paris or Washington. But beneath the surface, the contradictions widened. Public construction projects bore new signs, funded by strategic partners. But no one said who those partners were. In villages, Russian engineers worked alongside Burkinabe laborers, building roads, clinics, even drone landing pads. Yet no one knew where the funding began or ended, and journalists who asked too many questions found their press credentials quietly revoked. A young reporter named Alimata B. tried to investigate the dual command structure in the security forces. Within days, her press office was shuttered. She later reappeared in Abidjan, where she told foreign media, "Burkina is not a dictatorship, but it's not a republic anymore either. It's something in between a waiting room of history." Elders in the countryside remembered a different time, the era of Thomas Sankara, when dreams of Pan-Africanism and people-powered revolutions still lit the horizon. For many of them, Traoré was the first leader since Sankara to speak unapologetically of sovereignty. But even some of them whispered concerns. "This is not what Sankara meant," one retired teacher said during a village council in Koudougou. He wanted dignity without chains, not new chains with different logos. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The West had failed, but the East wasn't delivering liberation, only leverage. Across Ouagadougou, a new term had entered local slang, les invisibles, the invisible ones. It referred not to ghosts or spirits, but to the pale-skinned security personnel who appeared at government buildings, air bases, and strategic sites. They spoke little, drove tinted vehicles, took no interviews, but everyone knew who they were. The Russians, people muttered, but no one said it too loudly. Even senior officials found their meetings monitored. The new telecom network, rebuilt after the April blackout, was faster, more secure, and fully encrypted. But not by Burkinabe hands. One internal memo from the Ministry of Civil Service warned, "Do not store sensitive information on any national cloud service without clearance from the Bureau for Strategic Sovereignty." The message was clear. Trust had become a controlled resource. Traoré had made gold the centerpiece of his economic doctrine. But gold, like power, was slippery. The nationalization efforts were incomplete. Foreign companies sued in international courts. Meanwhile, artisanal miners who had hoped for freedom from corporate control now faced militarized exclusion zones run by joint Russian-Burkinabe security teams. In theory, revenues were increasing. In practice, the state's books were more opaque than ever. A finance ministry official speaking under condition of anonymity described the shift. The old corruption was French. The new corruption wears no flag. And as prices rose in urban markets, many began to ask, where is the gold going? The one place where dissent still lived freely was online until that too changed. By late 2025, the government introduced the Digital Sovereignty Act, a sweeping bill that required all social media platforms to register local offices, store data on national servers, and comply with BSS content guidelines. Western tech firms balked. Russian and Chinese providers stepped in. TikTok disappeared. A local clone, Zaka, launched in its place, fast, smooth, and tightly monitored. Young activists adapted with encrypted channels and coded messages, but the space for satire shrank. One popular meme page, Burkina Laughs, vanished overnight. The admin later posted from exile, "It's not that we can't laugh anymore, it's that laughter is now considered suspicious." As Burkina Faso's transformation deepened, its African neighbors grew increasingly nervous. Ghana tightened border patrols. Benin halted cross-border trade talks. Even Niger, nominally aligned with Traoré, began reviewing its own Russian security agreements. At the African Union, a quiet debate emerged: was Traoré a pioneer or a warning? A leaked memo from a Kenyan diplomat summed up the dilemma Burkina Faso represents, both the dream and the danger of self-determination. We must watch closely and prepare contingencies. In public, Traoré remained firm. In speeches, he invoked strength, independence, dignity. But those closest to him noted a change. He slept less, met more often with his Russian advisors than with his own ministers. His family, once visible, had all but disappeared from public life. In a private gathering with young officers, he reportedly said, "I trust only two things: history and preparation. Everything else is noise. But history has no favorites. And preparation can only go so far in a country where the people, not the plans, decide what comes next." Signs of stress multiplied. A mutiny among junior officers in Fadin Gourma. A student strike in Bobo Dioulasso. A brief skirmish between local police and Russian advisors in Gawa, quickly suppressed but widely whispered. Each event was small, contained, but together they formed a pattern, the kind that leaders ignore at their peril. And through it all, the insurgents remained. One night in December 2025, a convoy carrying military engineers was ambushed. 2 Burkinabe soldiers died. One of the wounded whispered to a nurse, "They were dressed like us, but they had better gear, and they didn't speak Moray." Was it jihadists? Was it rogue mercenaries? No one knew. And that perhaps was the most dangerous part. In January 2026, a small unmarked statue appeared overnight in Ouagadougou. It showed a young child holding a broken chain in one hand and a cracked mirror in the other. No one claimed it. But within hours, pictures flooded social media. Some called it the child of independence. Others called it the mirror of power. But everyone understood the message. Sovereignty is not just about casting out old masters. It's about seeing clearly who and what has taken their place.